Flashback, August 11th, 2022. I have just released the Helena Petrovna Blavatsky episode, and I was just saying to my guest for that episode, thank you so much for being on the show. And they sent me an email back basically saying, thank you for having me on. Guess what? I've got a joke for next episode. And so, to begin this episode, before we jump in and get to the nitty-gritty, I'm going to toss the ball to my guest for this episode and get them to tell a joke. So, Mitch, fire when ready.
Okay, I've held this in reserve. I haven't told friends or loved ones because I wanted the experience to be fresh for you and your listeners.
Amazing.
And I always appreciate how you leaven some of these somewhat heavy topics by kicking off with a joke, so I wanted to honor that as well. So here we go.
Amazing.
Did you hear the one about the Inuit skeptics?
No.
They're having none of it.
None of it. It's a Canadian joke.
It's a Canadian joke.
I love it. Oh, it's so good.
Feel free to use that.
Oh my! I'm definitely. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to follow that up with a joke of my own, which is in some way related to this topic, and it's not great, but I'm gonna try as I can. So, how many contemporary Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn members does it take to change a light bulb?
Oh, that is a really good setup. How many contemporary members of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn does it take to change the light bulb?
It's a mystery, but they will tell you for $1,189 US.
I like it. Can I do one more?
Yes.
Just because
absolutely,
I have a light bulb
100%.
joke, and
Do it.
how many Christian Scientists does it take to change a light bulb?
How many?
There is no bulb, and Mrs. Eddy doesn't think you're funny.
Mitch, you literally told that joke the last time you were on.
No, I didn't.
You did.
Well, I'll have to stop sniffing glue then. That settles it.
There we go. I see you got the Dead Kennedy shirt on.
Oh, yes,
so it's
I
like
do.
it's
Today's a special day.
it's perfect. It's sniffing.
This is the original Dead Kennedy shirt. It's terribly torn up, but I will not give it up.
Oh, absolutely not. You got to hang on to those. Hello, everybody. Welcome to What Magic Is This, a podcast about magic, the occult, the esoteric, the paranormal, the supernatural, and the weird. My name is Douglas Batchelor, and my goodness, this is an episode that probably should have happened towards the beginning of when I started podcasting, because here's the thing. I actually do get quite a lot of people reaching out to me saying, Doug, what is the difference between occult and magic? And while I think many of us may have an idea as to what the occult might be, using supernatural powers to get certain things, and the definition of the occult is somewhat locked in, occultism perhaps is not. And so on today's episode, I would like to get down to the nitty-gritty of occultism, because people are very curious, and I have quite the guest to help me with this one. So they are a historian of alternative spirituality and one of the most literate voices of esoterica, mysticism, and the occult around today. Occult America and the Miracle Club are essential reads round these parts. His newest work, subject matter, is indeed the very gist of this episode, modern occultism. Welcome back, Mitch Horowitz.
Thank you, Doug. Glad to be here.
Amazing. So my podcast, I say magic, witchcraft, the occult, and the occult is a slippery subject, to say the least. So big first question, Mitch. What is occultism then?
I try to be very definite with the term. The term occult itself comes from the Latin occultus, meaning hidden or secret. It is a term that entered English in the early 1500s when Renaissance scholars began to rediscover the spirituality of the ancient world, Rome, Greece, Persia, Egypt, North Africa. These were polytheistic traditions, nature-based traditions often steeped in magic, spellcasting, divination. And for centuries and centuries and centuries, these things vanished, first in the wave of Christianity that swept through the Western world, then in a later wave of Islam that swept through many parts of what we sometimes consider the West, sometimes not, but considering that Persia and North Africa were occupied by the armies of Alexander the Great, I think there's an argument to be made that those areas are part of the Western cultural sphere. Um, I try to be very specific about what I'm referencing when I use the term occult or occultism. It is, in some respects, a revivalist movement that seeks to reclaim the fragments, the threads, and they really are just fragments that we've been able to retain of the spirituality of the bygone world, of the spirituality of the pre Christian world. And people for centuries have been attempting to adapt, refit, reassemble, bring novelty to these ideas. And that is modern occultism.
Love it. I kicked this question to members of my Discord server. If you join up on my Patreon, people come onto my Discord because it was one of those things where I wanted once you were like, Doug, I want to come on the show, and I was like, perfect, let's talk about occultism. I really need to. I started to sit with this, like, well, how do I define occultism? And I'll give my definition a little bit later because it's very liquid. I'm just going to say that. But I wanted to hear what some other people think occultism is. So I want to share this with you, Mitch, because I think this person, who was my guest on an episode that I did about Paracelsus, however you want to pronounce it. And I just wanted to see, I wanted to pass it by you because I think this is pretty good. So
Sure.
this is from Steve, who was my guest on Paracelsus. It says, occultism is the philosophizing of mystical experience and symbol to establish a language game that can hint at non-linguistic reality. It differs from religion in its emphasis on the person and initiatory aspects versus the public and communal. Magic is a practice that informs occultism, but they are different in the way that philosophy of science and science are different. They can mutually inform each other, but are distinct. There is a Western tradition, so to speak, but that tradition is simply Platonism adapted to religious and magical traditions originating in the Mediterranean world, and is inherently disparate and non-overlapping in all of its parts, while having mutually identifiable aspects across those sun traditions that emerge from a dialogue, colonialism, and mutual archaic features that evolved from pre-Indo-European myth. Oh my goodness.
Wow. Well, look, basically, I agree, although my definition is just more historically centered. I don't, there is a lot of Western esoteric tradition that is, as I think Steve is suggesting, born out of a marriage of Platonism and maybe vestiges that we possess of pre Christian spirituality. Neoplatonism covers a lot of ground, but I wouldn't say that it's everything. I wouldn't say that it's
Right.
everything. In fact, I would say that since the 1980s, scholars who look at the late ancient world and its philosophies, like Gnosticism, Hermeticism, which grew out of Greece's encounter with Egypt, some of the last stages of what is called paganism, I would say in past generations that material was considered very, very heavily Neoplatonic, Western stuff, where late studies of Platonism were being married to late studies of, some magical threads here and there. I would say that, first of all, there's a lot of truth to that, but there are also exceptions. And for example, since the mid 1980s, scholars have increasingly come to regard Hermeticism as a more authentic expression of Egyptian philosophy than used to be the case, hence creating a bit more of a cleavage between the Hermetic and the Platonic, although the two are there. As for magic, I simply see it as a subset of what we call the occult. If I want to speak in historical terms, magic, spell casting, divination, and all of its vast and myriad forms are a subset of the occult. But there's one very important thing that I have to point out, and I think this is probably alluded to in Steve's comment, and it certainly informs my book. Occultism is a Western tradition. And again, by Western, I describe the territories that were occupied by Alexander the Great, which are really vast. I mean, we're talking
Yep.
from, Western Europe to North Africa to many points in between. Persia, obviously Greece, Rome, Egypt, speaking of North Africa. And the the occult is a unique development in the Western world for the simple reason that we have a schismatic religious history. If you grew up in India and you are part of the Hindu faith, you belong to a very uninterrupted ancient line of faith. In China, even though China is officially atheistic, you find uninterrupted lines of spiritual expression. Taoism, animism, Confucianism. In Japan, you'll find Shintoism. In other parts of Asia, Buddhism, which is an offshoot from Hinduism, still part of the Vedic tradition. These are living, uninterrupted traditions. The occult is not. The occult is an attempt to retain, revive, readapt everything that got lost and swept away for centuries and centuries across the arc of what we used to call them Dark Ages. We no longer use that term anymore. Now we might say early Middle Ages or Middle Ages or early medieval period, whatever terms you want to use. We have a schismatic religious history in the West, dramatically so. We went from polytheism to monotheism over a changeover of about 3 centuries. After the Emperor Constantine in Rome converted to Christianity around 312 or 313 AD, there was still a hell of a lot of paganism going on throughout the Western world. And the changeover, I mean, for example, paganism endured in the German speaking parts of Central Europe until well into the 700s. So this stuff didn't just happen, but over the course of centuries, those traditions that we group under a cult, the so-called pagan traditions. Not a word I'm in love with using because it has derogatory roots. It means like somebody who's from a backwater village and didn't hear the news
Country
of
bumpkin.
Christianity. Exactly. So I'm not in love with the term, but for sake of generality, I'll use it.
It's a useful term,
It's a
right?
useful term because I want it to be super clear. People might come to me and say, "Hey, Mitch, how come in your book you're not writing more, you talk about oracles, divination. Well, what about the I Ching, the ancient Chinese oracle?" Now, I do write about the I Ching in the book because it's actually probably, it may be, in fact, the Chinese oracle of hexagrams, maybe the oldest alphabet in human history. But that's not the point of this particular book. The point of this book is the occult, which is this is why we don't speak in terms of Jupiter worship, or we don't, necessarily in a general sense. We don't speak in terms of I mean, of course, we make references to Mithra, to Baal worship, and so on and so forth. But when Renaissance scholars were rediscovering this lost, vast network of ancient philosophies, they called it a cult, and that's the definition to which I'm deferring, which means it's Western. You have esoteric traditions all throughout the East. You have a Vedic esoteric tradition, a Buddhist esoteric tradition, and so forth. Um, but what I'm talking about is the schism that played out in the Western world.
So, what distinguishes occultism from, say, esotericism and even, say, something like witchcraft? Because esotericism and the esoteric will get brought up in almost the same breath as the occult. But so, is there something that distinguishes them?
I would say they're cousins, but they are very different in the sense that the esoteric, by nature of its definition, meaning some sort of inner core, inner insight, corresponds to the exoteric or outer. Usually, esotericism is the mystical inner core of a religion. So you have Jewish esotericism, Catholic esotericism. They might have some concerns in common with the occult, such as entering transcendental states or mystical states of some kind, just to cite one. But they are different. Occultism, I would say, by its nature, belongs to no religion. It arose as a way of referencing religions, temple orders, mystery traditions that had been wiped out, and all we retain are particles and threads. And you could have an esoteric tradition that very legitimately extends millennia and that belongs to a specific religion, whereas occultism tends to be much more general and much more an effort at revivalism, at adapting, readapting these beliefs to modern life.
Hear ya. So, your newest work is called Modern Occultism, and I've read the whole thing. I think it's fantastic. Everybody,
Thank you.
grab it, please. Some would argue, though, that occultism is thoroughly modern, anyways. Do
Yeah.
you agree with this statement?
It's a good argument, actually,
Yeah.
and in some respects, my title, Modern Occultism, is an oxymoron because everything that I've just been describing to you has to do with modernity's re-encounter with antiquity. But realizing that in a cold sweat one night at 4 o'clock in the morning, I decided to retain the title anyway because the truth is we also use modern in a colloquial way. For a lot of people, modern means industrial age. It means the era with which they're familiar, automation and, some beginnings of motor engines and electricity and things of that nature. So I defer to colloquialism in using it, but your point is absolutely well taken.
For sure. And you have said in this recording so far and in the book as well, occultism is in effect a revivalist movement. How is so you've mentioned how this is so, and if people are a little bit confused, go back to listen to Mitch's response to my first question. But why do you think there's always this looking back, Mitch, for occultism? You never hear about like techno. You hear a little bit of like techno occultism, but it's like it's all kind of like we it's not to be cynical, but we always kind of like raise our eyebrows when somebody's like, I'm a techno occultist. You're like, all right, I guess, but
I never know what that means.
I don't know it either. It's like, it's a weird one. But why do you think occultism is so enthralled with looking at the past and putting the past on some kind of a pedestal?
Well, we all find what we think of as verity in the past. We all, and this is probably true across human culture, we're worshipful of the past because we think that longevity and posterity connote value, and we think that if anybody wants to claim gravitas for a point of view, they want to say I was first, which is why you've got all these Rosicrucian groups that are styled in the 19th and 20th century, claiming ancient roots and so forth, or why that ran so heavily through the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, as you were referencing in your joke. I will say this, there are a lot of new forms of occultism. Sometimes they have what I would say is a pretense of ancient roots. And just because, and I can't say this clearly enough, just because something is old doesn't mean it's true. Just because something is novel doesn't mean it's flimsy or false. But it is important to know the difference if you want to know the foundation you're standing on. So take Eliphas Levi, for example, the French occult writer. His name was Louis Alphonse Constant, and he was an aficionado of Christian Kabbalah. So he phoneticized his name to sound like what it would presumably be if it were rendered into Hebrew. Hence, Eliphas
That old
Levi.
trick.
Yeah, that old trick, right? And um, so Levi was a seminally important French writer whose work in the 1850s, which is now represented chiefly in a book called Doctrine and Ritual of High Magic, 2 volumes put together. That, if there's an inception point to the 19th century occult revival, it's with him. Now, he's the guy who married tarot to Kabbalah and said, there corresponds to each of the trumps a meaning in Kabbalah, a numeral that corresponds to Hebrew, gematria, the Hebrew system of numerology. Um, and each tarot card corresponds, or the trumps do, to zodiac signs, elements, minerals, etc. So he created this perception of tarot as a correlate, direct correlate to Kabbalah and to alchemy. That is Levi's invention in terms of the history of Kabbalah, which itself extends to late antiquity and the Middle Ages. Again, a lot of the stuff that comes down to us today is not really ancient in the strictest sense of the term, because we're drawing upon an era where writing was common, and writing just became more common in various languages: Arabic, Aramaic, Greek, Hebrew, as time marched on. So we're dealing with records, in many cases, that really are from late antiquity, sometimes post Cleopatra, post Christ. Anyway, the fact is, Levi's correspondences between tarot and Kabbalah are sui generis. They're invented. But that
Yeah.
doesn't mean that there's not a brilliance to it. That doesn't mean that there's not an artistic quality to it. That doesn't mean that someone can't find value in it. I'm not trying to uh, use the term novelty in this condemnatory way, just as I don't use the term new age in a condemnatory way. I'm saying let's at least know the foundations upon which we stand. And understanding that doesn't serve as a blockage to imbibing Levi's system. But nor should the seeker, in my estimation, defend Levi's system as though it's the tablets coming down from Mount Sinai and get offended and take umbrage when the historicism points to the fact that it is a new and novel system. That doesn't mean it's not brilliant. Likewise, you take a very different case, Austin Osman Spare, the late 19th century, early 20th century British artist who created what we would refer to as sigil magic or chaos magic. For many people, the creation of a sigil, Latinate for little symbol, is synonymous with chaos magic. And probably most of your listeners know the routine. You take the sentence, you remove vowels or consonants, you create your symbol, and then you come to a state of ecstasy over it, which we all know doesn't involve masturbation. And
Not one bit.
not one bit. And so that was a new form, and that was a very beautiful, beautiful form because it brought simplicity to the very thickly constructed, very deeply liturgical, magical, and ceremonial rituals that emerged from the Renaissance through figures like John Dee or Cornelius Agrippa, extending back earlier, and and Speer, as an artist should, took a sledgehammer to that and said, "I think I can find the core here, distill it, and get the effect without necessarily subjecting the individual to ceremonies and rites and rituals that he or she may be unprepared to undertake, or may not have the time or the psychical, he wouldn't have said bandwidth, but have the psychical capacity to undertake, which I think is very tough for contemporary people. So you have newness, but very often that newness will be adapting an old form or taking inspiration from an old form.
Definitely. Love it. Great answer. So, my show, known for its history, and this book is just chock full of history. And so I absolutely love it. In your opinion, Mitch, where and when does occultism in a Western context, quote unquote, start?
Well, I would say that if we could name a year in which Western occultism starts, and I'm doing this just for fun, realizing that it's very difficult to hang a particular date on anything, especially given that history is messy and has a lot of switchbacks and slowness sometimes. But I would say the year 1460 or 1462 is when occultism started, because those are the years often given, and the dates are confusing, for when a Byzantine monk entered the court of the Renaissance Florentine leader Cosimo de' Medici with a cache of uh, manuscripts on papyrus scrolls that were attributed to Hermes or Hermes Trismegistus. This was the rebirth of the Hermetic literature, Egyptian Greek literature written down in the Greek language that drew upon, or at least claimed to draw upon, authentic Egyptian esoteric tradition. A claim that I believe is defensible and has grown more defensible over the past generation as we've discovered earlier and earlier references in Egyptian thought that resonate with this late ancient Hermetic literature. But be that as it may, 1460, 1462, the years are a matter of debate. Um, a Byzantine monk who probably was working as an antiquities scout for Cosimo, who was deeply fascinated with Platonism, Neoplatonism. It was a dream of his to revive the ancient Neoplatonic academy, which had been shuttered centuries and centuries earlier in Athens, to give new birth to that in Florence. Again, we see the revivalist impulse. The monk walks in, possesses, hands over to the ruler these manuscripts signed by the mysterious man god Hermes Trismegistus, thrice greatest Hermes, and Cosimo instructs his court translator, Marsilio Ficino, to stop translating Plato, of all things, and turn his attention to translating these Greek manuscripts into Latin, which was, of course, the lingua franca of the educated classes. Um, he does so. Marsilio does so. Cosimo is able to read the Hermetic literature before his death in 1464. It fulfills a life dream. And about 6 years later, this material is published. And what we would consider the Renaissance is not only in full swing at that point, takes a little longer to reach England, but it's in full swing. And because of this rediscovery of the Hermetic manuscripts, the Renaissance immediately, in its artwork, in its probings, in its scholarship, takes on an occult character. It takes on a full-throated fascination with the ancient world. The Renaissance mind was in love with the idea of there being a prisca theologia, an ancient primeval theology that was older than anything else. And Renaissance thinkers very often associated this ancient theology with ancient Egypt, which was a pretty good leap, And they feel that these Egyptian primeval ideas are encrypted within the Hermetic literature. So if I had to give you a date, that's a pretty decent one, 1460, 1462.
Well put. So, what changes can we see through the years from the producing of the Corpus Hermeticum, as it is called, by Marsilio Ficino, to, let's say, the beginning of the 19th century? What kind of things occur within the world of occultism?
Well, by the beginning of the 19th century, occultism had lost all prestige. It was decentered from every campus, academy, seminary, any place where there was learning going on. Occultism by that stage was for eccentrics and weirdos. Um, Although, of course, first of all, what we call eccentrics and weirdos can have a lot to offer. I used to had to once explain to a lawyer at work back in my publishing days, said to me, you're assembling quite a list of crank literature. And I said, not crank literature, fringe literature, fringe literature. There's a difference. And so, um, but I digress. By the late 19th century, occultism had no prestige virtually anywhere outside of maybe some self-styled Rosicrucian societies, Freemasonic lodges. The fact is, by the tail end of the Renaissance, around 1614, there was a linguist and philologist named Isaac Casaubon who published a definitive critique of the Hermetic literature. And he demonstrated with an airtight case that the Hermetic literature was not written or produced in deepest antiquity. It was produced in late antiquity, post Cleopatra, post Christ. And he was able to compare literary forms with other older forms and other newer forms and carbon date the Hermetic literature as it was. And here occurred, I think, a terrible cleavage in Western thought and a mistake in Western thought that has impacted us until this present day, in which it is currently, I believe, being somewhat repaired. The notion was that because the Hermetic literature was, I'm not going to say exposed because there was nobody trying to work a scam, but because the hopes that surrounded the Hermetic literature were dispelled in terms of it being super ancient, something that goes back to the period of the biblical patriarchs or even earlier. The literature itself was seen as fraudulent, spoiled, polluted, and that was a huge mistake. And again, this is a mistake that's only being repaired in our own era. Um, the fact is, almost all of our ethical, religious, and classical traditions, literally from Homer to Lao Tzu, began as oral tradition. And we, in fact, have very, very little evidence for these figures even existing. We don't know who Homer was. We don't know who Sun Tzu was. We don't know who Lao Tzu was. I mean, we like to speak of Pythagoras, for example. Presumably there was such a figure, but nothing attributed to him was ever published. Students, sometimes centuries after the fact, were publishing material attributed to Pythagoras. We're not rock solid certain about the identity or even the existence, to be frank, of Socrates and Plato. I mean, we love to speak in these very expository ways about these figures, but it's all very mysterious. The whole notion of an author even having an individual identity is, in many respects, a modern notion because ancient authors used to write on behalf of a school, an academy, a government, an army, something like that. And that's why the name Hermes Trismegistus got affixed in the first place to this literature, because a Greek scribe toiling away anonymously in Alexandria, wanting to lend gravity to his work, would very frequently affix the name of an ancient sage or scribe. So we have all this pseudepigrapha, so called, that is attributed to Moses or King Solomon or Abraham. None of it's true. Some of it does correspond with biblical writing or rabbinic writing or what have you. But the Hermetic literature was deemed fraudulent because its timeline, or its hoped for timeline, was disproven. What was not understood was just because something was written down at a certain point does not mean it started then. If Hermeticism is not based on oral tradition, that would actually make it an exception in the history of Western ideas, and Eastern ideas for that matter, where almost everything was based in oral tradition until getting written down and having a byline affixed to it at some later date. Um, I've mentioned that this point of view has been reversing. In 1986, there's an author named Garth Fowden who published a very important book called The Egyptian Hermes with Princeton University Press. And he made the contention in a very readable work of scholarship that, in fact, significant elements of Hermetic literature correspond to later dates in antiquity. And ever since that time, I guess you could say now, going back a generation, that view has held sway within the academy. So we are, as a civilization, for the first time, reversing this error. And the fact is, I would tell you that the first really decent, serviceable translation of the Hermetica was not produced until 1992. It was published by brilliant translator, beautiful writer named Brian Copenhaver, who published a book called Hermetica with Cambridge University Press, which has done yeoman's work of issuing this kind of literature. And that translation, along with another translation that came out in 2000 by Clement Salmon and a team of translators at Inner Traditions, those are, in my estimation, the first truly serviceable translations we have of this
Agree.
literature.
Yeah.
Yeah, this
Yeah.
literature had been neglected. You will find no Hermetic literature in the Harvard's Loeb Classical Library, for example, which is supposed to be
No.
the canonized spectrum of classical literature. There's no Hermeticism in it whatsoever. The first English translation, and damn near the last, was produced in 1651 by a writer named John Everard, and that was relied upon. And there were Victorian era translations, including a brilliant one by G.R.S. Mead, who was a secretary to Madame H.P. Blavatsky. And Mead was fantastic. Mead is just a heroic figure, but his translation is very turgid, very hard to get through.
Yeah.
It's written in a very
Yeah.
thick Victorian language, which I think he believed would lend gravitas to the text, but that was a big mistake. And so Mead, he deserves enormous credit because a lot of translators and scholars stand on his shoulders without acknowledgement. But his stuff is very hard to read. Whereas Copenhaver comes along and it's beautiful. It's sterling. And I often say in front of audiences, look, y'all, um, our generation is in a special place because we who are English speakers have a chance for the first time to read really good, serviceable English translations of the Hermetica. You've got Copenhaver, you've got Salomon. There's a scholar named David Litwa who did a book for Cambridge called Hermetica II very recently, where um, he goes further down the historical timeline than Copenhaver did, and translates works by Stobius and other really, really late ancient figures. I mean, figures who were around in the very, very twilight of paganism, 400s, 500s. I mean, really the end. And so we're recipients of this. The greater problem remains unsolved, which is the problem of binary thinking. It's this either or. Either it's the real McCoy or it's garbage. Either it's super ancient and old, or it's some newfangled mutt and it's a piece of shit. And it's a huge mistake. And people use this language and they think that it makes them sound kind of no nonsense. For example, I talk about the modern Hermetic adaptation, the Kybalion, which came out in
Right.
1908. Of course, it's a modern work. Of course, it's a modern novelty. Um, and yet, there are people who sort of line up to take shots at it as if that's um, a sort of
I
merit
was in
badge of
that line.
serious.
I don't know if you've listened to my Kabbalion episode. I was in that line,
How
Mitch.
dare you? I'll
I'm
fix
sorry.
you, Douglas. Um, no, look. What's important is clarity. I mean, my contention is that the Kabbalion, a book I rejected for a long time too. I mean, believe me, I wrote a piece about the Kabbalion on Boing Boing years ago that was
Right.
probably somewhat dismissive of it, but I changed my mind because I came to
Mm.
feel that it is it is a legit modern sounding of certain hermetic themes, and we can't get overly caught up with what's new, what's old, what's real, what's fake. What matters is the vintage and the quality, and understanding the vintage means saying, hey, look, we realize this stuff didn't go back to again the Saint Moses coming down from Mount Sinai, if he ever did, with the tablets. A lot of our stuff is newer than we think. Anyway, I digress. My point is that binary thinking is one of the great difficulties that we in the West have in general. It may have brought us some very good things in terms of logic, cause and effect, and the scientific method itself, but we get caught up into it to the point of peril where we have this incapacity to talk past absolute positions, and that's some of what was being represented in the deplatforming, so to speak, of the Hermetica in the late Renaissance. The idea was, well, because it's not old, it's compromised, and it got neglected for centuries, and as such, we wind up neglecting a piece of our own past.
Definitely. I think I like your starting point for occultism, but there's another one that I would definitely throw in there as kind of like the 1-2 punch, and that is the 1533 publishing of the 3 books of occult philosophy by
Absolutely.
Agrippa. That is
Absolutely.
where magic becomes like this aspect that informs occultism. Like, and you cannot separate that book from
Right.
occultism. Like Eliphas Levi, who we will talk about a little bit more in detail a bit further on down the line, took so much from, yes, the tarot correspondence to the Hebrew
Absolutely.
letters is big, but pretty much he's just aping everything from Agrippa and
Right.
by proxy the Golden Dawn. So hugely popular text. You talked a little bit about secret societies, and you mentioned the word Rosicrucian a little bit earlier. So what part did they play in the formation of what we were call modern occultism?
Well, weirdly enough, in 1614, the same year that Hermes Trismegistus was dethroned, there began to circulate above ground in Central Europe um, Latin and German manuscripts that proclaim the existence of a hidden brotherhood whose job was to preserve uh, ancient occult and esoteric wisdom, and whose wish was to create a beneficent society where they would be, or there would exist hospitals for the public, schooling for the public, a degree of ecumenism, unity among the Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, radical ideas in 1614. These manuscripts were around for a while. They probably go back, at least the earliest of them, the Fama Fraternitatis, our famous fraternity, that probably goes back to 1610, but it didn't circulate above ground until 1614. So there were 3 chief manuscripts that began circulating over the ensuing 3 years. They were written alternately in Latin and German. I believe the first was German, then Latin, then German again, and they just entranced the imagination of a lot of European seekers who hoped to locate this secret brotherhood, join this secret brotherhood. This was the prototype secret society of the modern world, and there's no record of a Rosicrucian Brotherhood really existing. I mean, we certainly have no membership rolls, no meeting records, no minutes, nothing of that sort. And there is doubt as to whether the movement existed at all. But it was a thought movement. It certainly was a thought movement. This material had to come from the hands of someone. It may have come from radical reformists within the Lutheran Church who were very disappointed with the progress of religious freedom in Europe. The historian Francis Yates thought it might have come from disgruntled followers of the magician John Dee, who had sort of been disgraced after the death of Queen Elizabeth. I think the greater likelihood is that it came from radical Lutheran thinkers, so-called pietists, mystics within the Christian tradition, who were very let down with the with the progress of religious freedom in Europe, which really started to slow at that point and continued to slow thereafter for probably another 150 years. So that's the beginning of the modern sense of the secret society, the Rosicrucians, the Brethren of the Rosy Cross. And they were very Christian in language and in nature, but they also used alchemical symbolism and ideas, occult ideas, belief in magical processes. You find these things woven within the Rosicrucian manuscripts.
The 19th century, as you mentioned, is basically when occultism becomes a discernible subject, is when it becomes something that we can point and look at and say, like, this is kind of where this takes a familiar shape. So, what was leading up to this? Like, right before the 19th century, before it starts to explode with things that we will definitely touch on. So, what was happening?
What was happening is that people who retained occult beliefs usually retained them in private underground. One of them was Sir Isaac Newton. It wasn't discovered until the mid 20th century, but Isaac Newton created the first English translation of what is probably the most famous Hermetic work called the Emerald Tablet, which is a work, again, probably very late in antiquity. The earliest version we have is in Arabic from around the year 800 AD. And Newton translated the work from Latin into English, and it contains the famous line, true without falsehood, certain and most true, that which is above is as that which is below. So, as above, though below, is a phrase that almost everyone has heard without necessarily referring it back to Hermeticism. And so Newton was doing this in a fairly underground way. His papers were purchased by the economist John Maynard Keynes. And Keynes observed beautifully, when I found all this material and I found the depth of Newton's interest in alchemy, I realized he wasn't the first of the rationalists, he was the last of the magicians. He was a
Love
bridge
it.
between the two. It was so beautiful. And it's
Yeah.
freaky because nowadays, anybody who's educated in occult subjects is probably aware that Newton was interested in alchemy, but we really didn't know that until the mid 20th century. His papers were just moldering somewhere, and Keynes purchased them out of his private interest, and this material became known. Um, so there was interest, of course, but the interest tended to be quieter. It tended to be more underground. It was expressed more through uh, poetry, verse, works of drama. If a person was interested in astrology, it was not considered a very respectable interest. It was probably something that a person would be no more or less public about than they would today. Some people were okay with it, other people thought it marked them as a rube. So occultism was not part of the intellectual and certainly not the institutional scene in the early 19th century.
Definitely. I think also one of the things that doesn't get brought up enough in occultism because they're kind of seen to be different, but I think that the Romanticism movement had a profound effect
Tremendous.
on occultism. Like, and it's not a lot of people talk about it. I love the fact that you bring up William Blake in your book, and it's just like a huge monumental figure that I have a ton of respect. The mythos of Romanticism has its fingers in so many aspects of occultism, and that it's someday I'm sure somebody will use this as a subject of a study, even more than it is being talked about nowadays. But let's talk about the 19th century. And speaking of Romanticism, this guy, he was a bit of a romantic because he was kicked out of. He was trying to be, I forget, a priest. He fell in love with a girl. They kicked him out. So he's a romantic figure. His name is Louis Alphonse Constant. Mitch has brought him up already, which would be Eliphas Levi or Eliphas Levi. Mitch, this is where my definition of the occult comes from. So I'm not sure if the kids will remember, but there was a website back in the day called 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon. Now, hang with me, everybody. Um, what would happen is that you would try to find an actor and you would input it into this website, and you would try to stump this website because you were trying to see if you could pick an actor who is not in some way 6 degrees connected to Kevin Bacon. So Kevin Bacon, of course, the actor, and so he was in a ton of movies. And for the most part, what you would come to the conclusion, having visited this website, it was popular in the early aughts, is that in some way every actor or every person who has ever worked on a movie is in some way 6 degrees at least away from Kevin Bacon. My definition of the occultism is 2 degrees of Eliphas Levi. I think if anything can be connected in 2 ways, either in the past or going forward from Eliphas Levi, then it is in some way occultism. So, is Eliphas Levi the king of occultism?
Certainly, he is in terms of its revival. He is the king of the 19th century occult revival. I used to attribute the 19th century occult revival to Madame Blavatsky, and that's certainly true. But he was Elvis, and she was the Beatles.
Right.
And as every member of the Beatles would have said, before Elvis there was nothing, which John Lennon did say. And I mean, Levi was really it. He was extraordinary. He was so without precedent at that time. Not only was he kicked out of seminary, or he voluntarily left seminary because he was in love with a woman and he didn't want to abide celibacy, and he also had religious and political questions that went outside the parameters he encountered in seminary. He was also a very early proto socialist. He was a pre Marxian socialist, for which he was thrown in jail for a period of about 11 months in Paris in the late, late 1840s. And he paid for his beliefs in a way that is difficult for people to relate to today. Today, in the 21st century, we are all so accustomed to mouthing off on social media and so forth, and people love adopting these labels, almost as preening displays of how radical they are, how this they are, how that they are. But here was a man who was nonviolent, not part of any revolutionary cell, and just for writing in opposition to the monarchy. And France was still struggling through a monarchical period after Napoleon was deposed, and there were different strings of monarchs who came and went. And he wrote against the monarchy. He wrote in favor of a social polity that looked something like democratic socialism, something like a pre-Victorian version of democratic socialism, for which he and his publisher were fined and jailed. That will refine your psyche for you. That'll tell you, what do I really believe in? What do I not believe in? What if anything, am I willing to pay a price for? Part of the reason I believe there's so much blather in our world today is because it's so consequence free. If you had to speak out in such a way in China or in many nations of the Middle East or what have you, you would be facing questions of life and livelihood, as plain as the words I'm speaking. And the absence of that uh, serves to remove, it's not that I want there to be some kind of brutal consequence that people have to face, but the prospect of facing absolutely no consequence whatsoever, even to the point of anonymity, weakens the character. And Levy had no such character. He stood for what he believed in such a way that it cost him physical freedom, it cost him money, it cost him reputation. The conditions in a Parisian prison in the mid 19th century were horrible. I'm sure there were many, many deaths from disease, lack of hygiene, lack of decent food or potable water. He emerged. He was still looking for power in a way that wasn't explicitly political and in a way that wasn't explicitly religious. And he felt possibly that by reviving occult tradition, and as you said, his form of access, his port of access was Agrippa, one might be able to come up with a modern conception, a modern philosophy of power, very much informed by Christian coordinates. People who read a good translation of Eliphas Levi today might be surprised at how Christian it really is, just as they might be surprised at how Christian and Abrahamic the Golden Dawn is, for that matter, how sharp the divisions are drawn between white and black magic, and how sure that the author is that he's always on the side of white magic. I dispense with these terms altogether, but he did nonetheless create a sense of connection to a version, a variant of occult antiquity or late antiquity. The field of Egyptology was underway at that point. Napoleon invaded Egypt in 1799, brought with him an army of draftsmen, naturalists, archaeologists, and very much created the field of modern Egyptology as we know it. So the Rosetta Stone had been discovered, hieroglyphs to some extent were being decoded, monuments, writings of the ancient world were once again available. There was fascination with Egypt. There was fascination with ancient civilizations in general, and Levi decided he was going to close that circle, and so he wrote what became Doctrine and Ritual of High Magic, published in one volume in 1856. And that really marked the re entry of occultism into the artistic, spiritual, and intellectual psyche.
100%. And it's crazy for people who I think, particularly nowadays, who have certain figures talk about magic and the occult, and so they'll be very familiar with everything from, say, like angels to the Ars Goetia and whatnot, and of course this kind of hermetic Christian Kabbalah. But I want to say, if this is your jam and you haven't read Doctrine and Ritual of High Magic, you will be shocked at just how many touchstones that you have are traced pretty much almost right straight to this book.
Yeah,
It's really crazy, and truly for me, why I consider him the king of occultism. And yes, he informed this idea of astral light, which was huge on somebody like Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, who we talked about
absolutely.
in an earlier episode. And theosophy gets tagged into with this again, 2 degrees. It's just straight to Elivis Levy. I want to ask you though, before we get to the 20th century, of course, we don't have time to go into every individual who's been impactful on modern occultism, but is there somebody besides Levy and Blavatsky that you think folks really need to know about?
Well, of course, everyone knows about Crowley, and so much goes to Crowley. And however one might think of him as a person, he was just extraordinary as an artist. And his efforts aesthetically and in terms of I would say actually in terms of the literary gravitas he brought to something like Book of the Law, cannot be overlooked even for a moment. It's sort of, again, it's stating a name that everybody knows, but if you go back and read Crowley, it is astounding to see the depth, and I would say in some cases the gravity of his output. Um, Jack Parsons is a figure for whom I came
Yeah.
to feel a great deal of affection. He was a deputy to Crowley late in his life. They didn't get along. They had a split. Imagine that.
Right.
And but I came to feel a very deep affection for Jack, and I came to identify very deeply with his search because, like Jack, when he died, I also feel a deep urge to simplify some of this material. Jack felt that the um, the Crowley liturgy, the oeuvre that Crowley has created, was so thick with ritual and ceremony and different words and terms and charts. And Jack had a sterling intellect. It was no problem for him to go through all this stuff, even in an earlier form when it was less available for the reader than it is today. But Jack came to feel that it was too recreative of an orthodox religious style, which is my feeling. And I had Jack lived, it's possible that he would have pioneered, as Austin Osman Spare did, a simpler, more elemental style of occultism. And that's something I'm very interested in. So I came to admire Jack very, very deeply.
Yeah, I my mind constantly goes to, and I have yet to do an episode. Everybody's telling me you need to do an episode on Jack Parsons, but part of me just wonders what would have happened if he had got to. He was planning on heading to Mexico, and I would have just loved to have seen a bit more of, because I know that the influence of Mexico. If anybody who spends time in Mexico, particularly where Jack was wanting to go, can't help but be touched by the magic of the place. So
Yes.
it's one of those great mysteries for me. It's just like, man, I wonder how it would have looked had Thelema headed to Mexico, Jack Parsons style, because Crowley actually lived in Mexico for a period of time, but the
Yeah.
influence of Mexico was kind of slight on Crowley. He kind of surged his own path, and it just yeah, very interesting character,
It's one
worthy
of the
of
great what ifs
examination.
of
Yeah.
modern spirituality. I mean, Jack was just so remarkable. I judge his career a success. Some people would judge Jack's career a great big disappointment. He partnered with L. Ron Hubbard, got ripped off by Hubbard. Hubbard steals his
His boats.
partner, his boats, his money.
His, yep.
Crowley dumps Jack because he thinks he's weak and he's a fool. One could very easily use those expository events and say, "Ah, gee, the guy was just a great big dupe with a good scientific intellect." That's not my judgment at all. Fortunately, through the efforts of Jack's wife, Marjorie Cameron, uh, his writings, few though there were, have been preserved, or some of them, and they bear reading, and I address them in the book. And I just think he was a wonderful man. I would like to have known him, and I don't say that about everybody in this book.
No.
Although I would
Yeah,
like to have
there's
known most people in this book, with a few exceptions here and there, perhaps.
here's the thing. I've got a hard time to Levy, but he is one of those characters. Just I think he would have been amazing to know. Like everybody talks
Yeah,
about how cool he was, and people were talking about Levy at the time. You can find people speaking about him, and he was very unhealthy towards the end of his life. Sorry everybody to go back to somebody we just talked about, but I say in my episode on Eliphas Levy, I would have loved to have known this guy. He seems right up my alley, and
yeah.
Jack definitely as well. I'm not sure I could say the same about Crowley. I'm not,
I'd step very carefully around him. A lot of people got hurt.
yeah.
People have trouble. I mean, I think that another thing that needs to happen in our generation is we need to digest Crowley. I think that
Yeah.
he was such a brilliant artist. He was such a brilliant pioneer. My rule of thumb for dealing with objectionable figures is this: if you don't have to adopt any of their objectionable traits or points of view in order to enter their work, then the work speaks for itself. It's that simple. You don't have to be an anti Semite to like Wagner. So,
Right.
we understand that was the man and this is the work. Crowley, he was cruel, he was bigoted, he was spiteful. I don't think any of those things are necessary to enter the book of the law, which I find very, very, very beautiful. Um, so that's where the dividing line is for me. And we have to be able to digest these figures in the same way that we do other artists.
100%. So we've mentioned Crowley. We've mentioned a little bit about Theosophy. We're kind of dancing around Theosophy, which is kind of strange because, as far as I'm concerned, Theosophy is such a huge part of occultism, and even if people
Enormous.
don't consider themselves Theosophists, too bad. You're doing Theosophistic things. Like it's too bad, whether you'd like to think so or not.
You are a theosophist, right? Well, Madame Blavatsky's fingerprints are just on everything, and one of the things that
Correct.
astounded me as I was working on the book is even down to the rebirth of modern witchcraft. There's Madame Blavatsky's fingerprints, someplace I did not expect to find them. It's a couple of generations removed, of course, but um, through her protege Annie Besant and Annie Besant's daughter Mabel started up a lodge that abided or sought to revive witchcraft traditions. Gerald Gardner, Englishman who retired to the southern British coast just before World War II, was a member of this lodge. And later in the 50s, Gardner writes Witchcraft Today, which really is the ignition point of the rebirth of Wicca, witchcraft. So you see the family tree, not too far removed, goes back to Madame Blavatsky. It's just extraordinary.
So once we get to the 20th century, what kind of twists and turns does occultism take to shape what we now call modern occultism? And I'm actually going to tack on another question to this one because some occultists would be contemporary occultists would be aghast to know that you include Satanism as
Oh,
occultism.
full throated, full throated. This is another area in which I think we as an intellectual community need to grow up. These things have got to be understood as part of the tradition of the occult, the alternative, the esoteric, the outsider search. To exclude them is just to engage in a practice of taste or sentiment. It's part of the scene. There was a variant of satanic thought, uh, generally speaking, among the Romantics. It's sometimes referred to as Romantic Satanism. This was expressed chiefly in the work of Lord Byron. It was also expressed in the work of Percy Bysshe Shelley, to a lesser extent in William Blake, to a certain extent in the work of John Milton, the aspects of a heroic or a romantic Satan as a not quite metaphorical figure ran through the works and the imaginations of some of the brightest lights of the Romantics. There were, of course, errant individuals um, of greater and lesser gravitas in the fin de siècle culture who adopted Satanism just as a provocation or as a personal peccadillo. I'm not hugely concerned with that, other than just to note it historically. And then you have figures like Anton LaVey and Michael Aquino. uh, LaVey, I think of as a great performance artist and provocateur who never shed the carny image that he always claimed for himself. And
Right.
there are creative fibs in that career too, which I talk about in the book. Aquino was who died recently, was a greatly heterodox figure who produced a literary output that warrants scrutiny. And I think there's just a Pollyannishness and immaturity and a sentimentality to resisting including Satanism as part of the occult canon. And if those who consider themselves occult intellects, stand against this tide, it's just going to wash over them because it's already been adopted in academia. There's a brilliant Italian sociologist, Massimo Introvergne, who I quote frequently in the book, who wrote a book called
Mhm.
Satanism: A Social History. Brilliant book that came out about 4 years ago. Per Flaxneld, another highly regarded academic, produced a book called Satanic Feminism, which is actually really about the the Satanism of the Romantics. There are lots more such books coming or that have been published. These are coming from places like Brill and Oxford University Press. I don't look to academia as being a stamp of seriousness or an imprimatur for anything. I'm just pointing this out as to say that as a field of study, a scholarly consideration of Satanism has been underway for about the past 15 years. So one can stand athwart history and yell, stop, but I'm not sure that it really does anything.
Right.
If it's not to your taste, then you can take the opposite point of view from me, as some people do, and say, I don't think this material is worthwhile, but be sure that you have your feet wet. If you haven't read the literary output of Michael Aquino, then you don't have wet feet. You may dip into it, not like it, shake it off, and that's fine. But to say that it's not a chapter in occult history, I think is just to engage in taste.
Definitely. So, for my take, I think so. We have theosophy, we have Eliphas Levi, occultism. A little bit further on down the line, of course, we do get Satanism, LeVay Satanism, Temple of Set, all of that kind of stuff. But from my vantage, probably the biggest touchstone that occultism takes in the 20th century is when Israel Regardie
Hmm.
releases the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn material between
Yeah.
1938 and 1940. A lot of the occultism in the 60s, it goes straight back there. And of course, that was a huge controversy from former members of the Golden Dawn who were still alive at that point. But what other major touchstones in the 20th century can you think of that really provide occultism with more of its continuum?
Well, certainly the popularity of Edgar Casey, the medical clairvoyant, played a very big role in,
Mm,
I would say, bridging the occultism of pre-World War II, post-World War II. Casey
right.
was a bridge figure in many, many ways. And Casey, due to his popularity, especially after the war, and he died just after the war, uh, just before the war ended. He died in early 1945. But it was really in the 1950s that Casey started to attain popularity, sometimes through the writings and works of other people. Um,
Right.
but Casey was a figure that presented uh, contemporary people, especially North Americans, with a entryway to the occult because he, again, always couched things in a very Christian terminology and language. He was a Christian, but terms like concepts like karma, astrology, reincarnation, numerology, crystal gazing, natural health, you name it. These were the Casey this was the Casey catalog. He talked about gleaning this information from the Akashic records, a concept popularized by Madame Blavatsky. And Casey was the occult's ambassador into the mainstream. And his influence goes a long way in explaining why Americans. I mean, for example, today we routinely use the term channel. I'm channeling, whatever when I say this, and you see it in headlines all the time in mainstream newspapers. Well, in the 30s, Casey was the one who fashioned the word channel in a spiritual sense. He was one of the first ones who talked about using meditation for therapeutic purposes, for medical purposes like stress reduction. Uh, Terms like reincarnation and karma, I think, became familiar to mainstream English speakers, North Americans, in the post-war era, largely due to Casey's popularity. So I'd have to give a lot of credit there. And then, of course, there are myriad other expressions. I mean, once Casey explodes across the cultural scene, and really once we get into the era of Woodstock, that's when occultism as a popular phenomenon just explodes. You've got books of astrology, books by Carlos Castaneda on bestseller lists, and there's no going back.
Absolutely. Yeah, The Morning of the Magicians, which is one of those things
Yeah.
where looking back, it's such a huge touchstone. I could probably do a whole episode about that one book, is odd and weird as it is and dated. I'm just going to say nowadays, the influence is so huge. I have to ask, Mitch, so what state of affairs do you see occultism having in the first 23 years of the 21st century and at this present moment?
Well, it's an exciting time, I think, partly because of the developments I was talking about earlier, that we in our generation have the first serviceable translations of Hermetic literature. More and more works of astrology that were written down in Hellenic languages, Greek, Latin, are being translated in our time. And I do think there's a convergence of conversation between those of us who are interested in the occult and those who are interested in the UFO question, because the UFO question begs, in its way, questions of interdimensionality. What is this stuff? Well,
Right.
is it some unknown super weapon? Is it ET? Is it interdimensional? And the funny thing is, I always point out to everybody,
Fairies. They're all
what's that?
fairies.
They're
They're all
fairies,
fairies.
right? And the interdimensional thesis sounds by far like the most far out
Mm,
of the three, and yet
right.
look again, because we actually have better models of interdimensionality today than we do of extraterrestriality. The
Right.
distances that a craft would have to travel are so vast they're unthinkable, and yet,
Right.
due to quantum mechanics and thanks to models like string theory, just a model, no more than that,
Right.
we have ideas about how interdimensionality might work. So it's not as far out as it sounds at first blush, and I'm excited by that.
Amazing. I have said this in other episodes before, but I truly think, and I would hope you agree, I truly think that as far as like occultism, but also Western ritual magic, we are at the most exciting period I've ever seen. There's a grimoire revival where we're looking back
Yeah,
at these older texts. I think we are so lucky to be living right now for us weirdos that take that this is our lives. There is no better point in history, no matter what anybody will tell you, there is no better point in history than right now. So
I agree.
enjoy it, everyone.
And don't
Enjoy
piss it
it.
away. Don't piss it
No.
away by wasting time attacking people on social media, or getting kind of wrapped up in like what is and isn't considered kosher or proper or right to
Right.
explore. I mean, I will say this: no no single factor does more to close a person off to opportunities than the absolute need to be right, And I think it behooves all of us. You can look at a thought movement, you can look at an idea, and you don't. You can find that there's something in it you don't like, and that's
Mm,
fine. I mean, measurement, judgment, they're part of human life, but we don't have to get into this headspace of being exclusionary or condemnatory or saying, I don't read that, I don't touch that, I don't look at that, I don't talk to those people. It's a very, very arid place. And that's tantamount to wasting this wonderful cultural moment that we've got right now.
Certainly. And I don't want to lay this at the feet of any one individual, but I do think that going through the works of somebody like Levy and Aleister Crowley, there is a sense of righteousness to what they write. And
Hmm.
there is a superiority complex that comes with that is not ironic in any way, shape, or form. And that a lot of people take their cues from those two individuals, whether they know it or not.
Right.
And Mitch is right. I think Mitch also has perhaps the greatest, and it's in a book that I haven't mentioned yet, but it's called Miracle Habits. But correct me if I'm wrong, Mitch, but Mitch has perhaps the single greatest piece of advice. And it's so simple that you can live by now, which is stop talking shit about other people and gossiping literally right now. Just stop it. It's so easy. And you will notice, wow, your life gets better. Imagine that. So that goes across all the boards. And the reason I'm mentioning this in the occult episode is because it's always been said, like, what do you call a group of occultists? You know, we got a murder of crows, you've got a parliament of rooks, an argument of occultists, right? So let's just stop talking shit and gossiping about people. That's
And
where I
you'll
where I
stand
stand.
taller. You'll feel it in an hour. People ask,
Yeah.
"What do I do with myself? Do I do another sigil? Do I cast another spell? Do I fast? Do I do?" Try to stop talking shit, including online, which is where most of
Yeah.
us live, for
Yeah.
1 hour and see if you don't stand taller. Because it does. We may not think so, but it does serve to degrade us, and rightly so, and to cover up that sense of degradation. We take another hit from the pipe, or we take another swig from the bottle, which means talking more shit. It's a terrible idea, and you're correct that we read some of these progenitors like Levi or Crowley, and we think that's how I should sound, or we think
Right.
that Oscar Wilde or Dorothy Parker. If you're them, you can insult people, but if you're
Right.
not them, then don't. Because
Right.
it's a terrible cultural aping that all of us imbibe, whatever our interests, and we think that having this rapier wit, sarcasm, causticism, cutting other people down, it's the cheapest commodity on earth at this point. It plays 24/7 over Twitter, and if you abstain from it, it'll bring you benefits that you'll feel within damn near an hour. So you can try it or not try it. But
Yeah, absolutely. So, I read a segment in a book recently which states in the long run, occultism, science, and religion are all compatible with one another, and the differences of opinion that presently divide them can all be resolved given mutual understanding and a willingness to learn from one another. Mitch, what can we make of this statement?
well, I think that there's truth to it insofar as all these things document human experience. Science is methodological replication. That's all it is. We've gotten in this bad habit of using the word science in tones of religiosity today. Science is
Yeah.
not synonymous. Well, I mean, arguably, it's a method behind that which can be considered reasonable and rational. And as such, it's given us fruits that are inconceivably great. But it is just that. It's a method of methodological replication. The occult is a means of reaching out to an unseen or hidden dimension or world. If you've got a theory that's taken very seriously among quantum physicists, the many worlds theory, going back to the 1950s, that posits that there may be, as a logical imperative, different intersections of time or different dimensions, well, there's a conversation. There is a conversation that can be held between students of metaphysics and students of physics. We may be a long way off from this convergence, but in a sense, this convergence has always been with us in that we're seeking to document and codify human experience. So alchemy gives way to chemistry, quite literally and etymologically. Astrology gives way to astrology. Well, they were one and the same in the ancient world. Seeking to be in touch with other dimensions or disincarnate entities. Well, it's not so far out in an era where we know that time bends and there are infinite possibilities and possibly many worlds. And then you bring in the UFO UAP question and things start to get weirder. So it's not a question of subject matter or category or where I camp, where I plant my flag. It's a question of it's a question of quality. It's a question of quality of your methodology. In modern occultism, I'm trying to create a historical work, not to say do this, don't do this is good, this is bad, but to say
Right.
what foundations do we stand on. So, insofar as that can serve as a tool in that conversation, that would fulfill my highest hopes.
Definitely. For myself, I'm sure a lot of people listening to this podcast, getting the historicity right, and we can talk about whether something's specious or not, but Mitch does a very, very good job in this book of really giving you the history of this very slippery concept of occultism. So it is definitely worth reading for everybody. And I still see modern occultism being something extremely appealing to many people. Is about 90% of the emails I get tend to be related to what folks would consider occultism. So, why do you think folks are so attracted to the mystical wiles of occultism to this day?
I don't know that most people would feel comfortable framing it this way, but I think they want power. They want a sense of power. I remember,
Agency.
yeah, agency, power, self determination. They want
Right.
tools that are going to help them express their sense of human agency in the world. They want tools that are going to help them see through some reasonable sense of self in the world, whatever projects, undertakings, expressions they want to put forth into the world, create. I think that we tend to look at power as a dirty word because it sounds tyrannical, but I use it because I really want to be blunt about the matter, and I think that we can't have authentic ethics, we can't have authentic relationships, authentic reciprocity unless we state our terms clearly. And I view power as something that should be renewable, that comes with obligations to others, otherwise it's just mere force. And a lot of times people embark on the spiritual journey and they hide it from themselves. And a lot of religious texts are created in such a way so as to assist in that perfuming. But they want power. And there's no divorce between power and ethics. In fact, if one acknowledges a thirst for power, then you'd have to be a terribly coarse and insensitive person not to see an ethical conversation as being a vital, critical part of that search. I do find that the people who line up first to talk about service and to talk about selflessness and to talk about bringing light into the world, in my personal experience at age 57 and having been on this path for a while, are the very first ones who will stick a shiv right in your ribs just as you
Yeah.
turn around.
Yeah.
The arbiters of probity are usually just like the moralists, the ones that are hiding hypocrisies. So let's be full throated, let's be plain, let's be transparent. I do think that the spiritual search in general is the search for power. And yes, that must occur hand in glove with a deep consideration of ethics and reciprocity and relationships. When you're really blunt, you might be surprised where it takes you because finally, we can drop the curtain and say, okay, maybe not everything that I'm about is strictly defined as service, light, love, forgiveness. Maybe I do want power and agency. What does that say about me? Isn't that a hell of a lot better point of inquiry than it is, condemning somebody else because they're doing that and I'm doing it clean? Let's be frank, you know.
Definitely. It goes to something I talked about in probably one of my most popular episodes. It's called How to Start Doing Magic. It's just the number one rule is throughout this entire journey, whether you consider yourself a wanderer in the occult magic path or not, is be honest with yourself at all times. Just be honest with why you're doing things. It's going
Yeah.
to change as you go, but be brutally honest. So I have to ask you, folks that want to dive a little bit deeper into the waters of occultism, what would you ask them to keep in mind?
Well, my concept of what that might mean has changed over the years. Many years ago, I
Okay.
used to say, oh, you should have some sort of an ethical classic text at your back so, as guardrails,
Right.
whether it be the Beatitudes or the Tao Te Ching or the Ethics of the Fathers, the Talmudic book. I no longer feel that way because I don't want to condition anybody else's search, just as I expect the same in return. I don't want my search conditioned. I think, frankly, people should feel very much at liberty to dive in wherever they want, not to over worry about prerequisites. Uh, I would say that in as much as you want to use a tool, you should care about how to use it, where does it come from, what is it about. Know something about your history. If you're interested in Kabbalah, know something about Hebrew. If you're interested in astrology, know something about astronomy. If you're interested in tarot, know something about its history and Eliphas Levi's theories and so forth. But enter where you wish to enter. I think that we're going to get directed by our passions under any circumstance, and that's part of being blunt and honest with oneself. And it's funny. I was in a cult bookstore many, many, many years ago on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, and it was called Enchantments, and I believe it's still there. And there was a guy behind the cash register, and a young woman came in, and she said she was interested in discovering things about magical Egypt and what could he recommend. And he ran down the books of John Anthony West, the independent Egyptologist who died years ago, who was actually a brilliant man, and he talked up Zahi Hawass, the government minister who, until Mubarak was overthrown, was the minister
Oh,
of antiquities in Egypt.
yeah.
And I just stood there gape mouthed that somebody behind the register at a bookstore dedicated to the occult would run down John's work, extol Hawass's work. I mean, Hawass, and the man has a job to do, but he's a government
Yeah.
minister. I don't think he's a very impressive figure intellectually at all. If you want to read him, go ahead and read him. But to exclude John's work, Serpent in the Sky in particular, is a brilliant book. It does a terrible disservice. I assume that young woman went off, found her own way, and then realized, well, maybe the guy behind the register wasn't so smart after all. But whatever the case is, I just don't want to. I don't want to prescribe, limit, set parameters on somebody. If you want to read the Satanic Bible, be my guest. It might get you reading John Milton, next week, which is a good idea too. If you want to start with Milton, start with Milton. Just don't set up these barriers for yourself. Throw yourself into it. Any sensitive, driven person will find the antecedents, but the starting point might be one of passion. And I would say just allow yourself to have that.
I love it. Yeah. And there is something to be said about if it moves, follow it. And particularly for something like the occult. If you find Christian slash Hermetic Kabbalah interesting, follow it. Like it's
Absolutely
not, I might,
follow it. Absolutely follow it. And I,
I
I
might
want
shit on it, but go ahead. Sorry.
to, Gershom Scholem, the great Kabbalistic scholar, in 1946, he's a German Israeli scholar of Kabbalah, now deceased. In 1946, he wrote a book called Modern Jewish Mysticism, and it really gave rebirth to study of Kabbalah, which had been dormant for a long, long time. He was not a fan of Aleister Crowley or Eliphas Levi, but he does remark in the book that he gives them a shout out, more Levi than Crowley, uh, for keeping a variant of the tradition alive at a time when
Yeah.
Jewish scholars were uninterested in it. There was a long stretch of time where Jewish scholars regarded Kabbalah as the crazy aunt up in the attic. And, yeah, she's our aunt and we love her and, we have to bring food and water up, but, we're not going to spend too much time up there.
Right.
And that's changed, of course. That has changed thanks to Sholem's efforts to a great extent. But he paid he did remark on these figures and said, look, at least they kept it alive, query alive. I think what did he refer to? He referred to the brilliant misunderstandings of Eliphas Levi, the brilliant misunderstandings of Eliphas Levi.
Right.
Okay, I'll take it, but he wasn't averse to or hostile to these figures. He wasn't unknowing of them. He was aware of them. And he pointed out, look, this isn't the actual tradition, but shame on those Jewish scholars who didn't keep the actual tradition alive. At least these guys, demonstrated interest in drinking from the well. And I agree with that. So I guess I'm really just saying, if you want to get into Christian Kabbalah, do it. Read Gershom Scholem too.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%. All right. We're coming down to the denouement of this episode, but I have to ask because it's what my show is known for. Tough question, but say somebody really wants to get to the pith of occultism, besides grabbing modern occultism, which I highly recommend for everybody. I was remarking to Mitch before we started recording, I'm surprised a book like this hasn't come out yet. Like, this is truly the first real good look at how what we call now occultism came to be. And it is stunning and great. And it's pretty much my favorite thing that Mitch has written since Occult America, although I love quite a lot of what Mitch. I haven't read everything, Mitch. Sorry, you write a lot. I don't know if you know this. You write a lot, but
I haven't read everything. So.
okay. But I really do love modern occultism. Let's get Mitch Horowitz's. And you did an article, I believe, on Medium about, and maybe things have changed, but let's get Mitch Horowitz's 5 occultism classics to better understand modern occultism.
Oh, wow. Well, I'll say it'd be easier for me to name writers than classics, but because classics
Okay.
is hard, I should take that question on its own terms. Um, well, first of all, Gary Lackman is just an excellent historian, and Gary's written so much. You can take your pick. I particularly like a book of Gary's that's very, very recent called Dark Star Rising, which is about occultism and some of the right wing politics around Trump. And I actually commissioned the book from Gary during my last days in publishing. Again, I still get people coming to me online saying to me, "You should read this book. Then you'll think twice about all this stuff." And I'm like, "Dude, I commissioned the book." But anyway, it's a great book, and a person shouldn't be put off by the fact that it's ostensibly about Trump because it deals with this current moment in time and how we got here, and it goes into some of the voices, including traditionalist figures and others who maybe fed into some of the occult thought that exists on the right wing, and it's just very valuable. It doesn't require you to check any political box. It's a book really worth reading.
It's not
Um,
polemical in any way. I
no,
don't
it's
think so.
definitely not
It's
polemical,
yeah.
and I don't think
Mhm.
Gary would ever stoop to that. Um,
No.
and books by Jocelyn Godwin, just incredibly important. If you want a good counterpart to Dark Star Rising, Jocelyn wrote a book called The Theosophical Enlightenment, where he actually talked about some of the dark days of the occult in the pre-Levi 19th century, where occultism was very much a vagabond philosophy, but there was still stuff cooking and there's still stuff going on that primed the pump for that later occult revival. And The Theosophical Enlightenment is just a brilliant, brilliant book. Richard Smoley and Jay Kinney produced a book called Hidden Wisdom, which is a collection of articles from Gnosis Magazine, one of the great publications that ever came out dealing with occult and esoteric topics. I would recommend anything by either writer, but that's a good book because it is a good compendium of some of the work that they produced at Gnosis Magazine in the 80s and 90s. Also, Richard has another anthology called Supernatural, which furthers some of that effort. So I recommend that. I have two more to go. Let's see. Walter Hanegraaff is a very, very important
Mm.
contemporary scholar of occultism. Walter has a new book out, came out last year, called Hermetic Spirituality and the Historical Imagination. And in that book, Walter does just an outstanding job of describing how fragmentary are the Hermetic teachings, as well as others that have reached us today. And while we are in a position of advantage because we have these serviceable translations that I've been extolling, we're also in a position of disadvantage because things got lost, things got mistranslated over the years. Scribes wrote things down and they imbued it with their own language, their own preferences. And so Walter in this book, I think, provides a really fine insight onto the disadvantages that any student of history, especially ancient history, faces. And for third and final, wow, that's a toughie because there's so many that I could name. I suppose I would have to say the books of Francis Yates are so important,
Mm.
three in particular: Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic Tradition, the Occult Philosophy in the Elizabethan World, and the Rosicrucian Enlightenment. It would be a toss up for me between occult philosophy in the Elizabethan World and the Rosicrucian Enlightenment. Yeats's books are about the revival of occultism during the Renaissance, which is so
Yeah.
greatly what we are drawing upon today. And she has come under dispute within academia. This is just the cannibalism that academia always engages in. It's
Yeah.
not unlike what we were just talking about before, the way in which people are unable sometimes to point out the smudges or the problems or the pockmarks in something without completely writing it off. And so historians today,
Right.
many academic historians, they line up to piss on the legacy of Francis Yates. And I reject that soundly because Yates was writing in the 1950s, 60s, 70s. She didn't have all the source material that people have today. She made some leaps that are objectionable, and some historians, I think, object to Yates because, heaven forbid, she wrote with ideals. She wrote with ideals. She did find within the Renaissance effort to preserve, revive, explore Hermetic tradition, a certain intellectual heroism. And I think there's truth to that. These people, the figures that were exploring Hermeticism and alchemy and occult revivalism during the Renaissance did so, even though it was a period of relative liberalism, they did so at considerable personal risk because you're still in a very church dominated atmosphere, and that's not going to change for centuries. They did so with a great deal of heterodoxy. They had no roadmap. And she finds within these figures a certain degree of heroics and romance. I find that within these figures. For some academics, that is a mark of compromise. They think she was sentimental, she was creating a kind of imaginary tradition because she liked these people. I think those criticisms are excessive. I think the historian can write with a sense of ideals without compromising integrity, verity, and I think that's what Yeats did. So those are my five biggies, allowing for some elasticity.
I love it. Yeah, the somebody else who I had on the show, Tobias Churton, has stated like the academic sledgehammer that has been taken to Yeats's work is a bit overwrought. It's still important to understand it, but she is a massively influential and just really enthralling writer, and
Yes, she's beautiful.
just
I mean,
yeah,
she's why I get in this business, to a very great
yeah.
extent. When I read her book, The Occult Philosophy in the Elizabethan Age, I was inspired to give a lecture at the Philosophical Research Society that was called The Occult Philosophy in American Life, and that became Occult America. That grew directly out of Yeats as inspiration.
Yeah, she's a fantastic figure. Has to be covered on this podcast because
Yeah. Oh,
yeah.
by the way, I
I,
didn't mention Manly Hall's Secret Teachings of All Ages.
oh,
You'll undoubtedly be comments. How dare he? Of course, Secret Teachings of All Ages. Hall's historicism uh,
it's like
is
it's that
problematic in a lot of cases, but
yeah,
it's a very, very important book and a very beautiful book and one of the most important pieces of curation of the 20th century. So I love the man.
absolutely. Yeah, he was one of the ones where I did a podcast on him and that book before I had a chance to interview you. And one of those things where you released a work about Manly Palmer Hall. I forget the title of it, but it's a really good book. And I didn't realize how much I would like that. I like the character of Manly. He's
Yeah,
very much like me, and I like that his version of occultism is, although a very kind man, is that he just didn't talk about anybody else or himself. He was a very private man, and I really admire that of him. So one of the things a lot of people will talk about is that they say like I'm not an occultist because I'll talk about everything out in the open and stuff like that. But I like the idea. I call myself an occultist because I'm not going to talk about myself or my political opinions or anything or anybody else at all. So that's what I occult.
I mean, I think that we can move on from the 1400s in terms of our definition of how an occultist interacts with the
Right.
surrounding world. I mean,
Yeah.
the term is a historical designation at this point. It's not like ancient men and women walked around saying, "Hey, I'm an occultist." Gnostics didn't
Right.
walk around saying, "Hey, I'm a Gnostic." These are modern terms,
Yeah.
so let's not get too hung up. And we use them to describe our forebears and ourselves, to the extent that we try to adapt these traditions.
Definitely. Mitch, got to ask, final question here. Where does occultism go from here, man?
Well, I think that the conversation around UFOs and occultism is just starting. I think that the conversation around metaphysics and physics, it's already begun. It's well
Yeah.
underway. You can find it in the pages of Scientific American, but that conversation is developing. And for me personally, I'm just deeply, deeply interested in simplicity. One of the reasons I've been writing a great deal recently about psychical research or ESP research is because I feel that if we can come to a place of real warranted belief in the extraphysical capacities of the psyche, it might be that takes us to a place where liturgy, ceremony, rite, ritual becomes less necessary. And I'm interested in that place of simplicity that Jack Parsons was reaching for. So those are areas that I'm watching.
Definitely, and we are living in what I think are the most interesting of times. And yeah, it was funny when we finished the Blavatsky episode. You said I'd love to come back on and talk about psychical research, and you do cover some individuals within this book, Modern Occultism. But yeah, we have some very very strange places to go. I
Yeah,
see, and it's going to be amazing. So, Mitch, congratulations on this book. I think it's a fantastic book, and I love the way that you write. I just want to say, like you have a fantastic way with words about you. I love the cut of your jib and the way that you write and speak about these things. So, Modern Occultism, it comes out when?
It's out September 19th. It is in print, digital, and audio, which I narrated, and it can be pre ordered. Anybody who's so inclined to pre order it, I thank you because pre orders really do help a book. They make a very big difference, and I appreciate it.
Wonderful. And what's next in the world of Mitch Horowitz? I have to ask.
Well,
You're going
I'm
to write
writing a new
another
book
one, no doubt.
at this instance called Happy Warriors, and it is portraiture of the pioneers of positive mind metaphysics: Neville Goddard, Napoleon Hill, Wallace D. Wattles, Ernest Holmes, and a range of
Ernest
earlier
Holmes,
folks.
interesting.
Yeah, I just read an essay on Ernest Holmes actually
Yeah.
on Medium. I'm very interested in new thought or mind causation because talk about simplicity. I mean, some people run down new thought because its forms of expression are so popular and sometimes, very admittedly, sensationalistic. But the fact is, the best of these thinkers, Neville Goddard in particular, were really trying to get down to the tax of whether the human mind, whether the psyche, the intellect, has causative abilities, and talk about getting back to basics. That's as basic as it gets. So I'm very interested in their methods and their struggles, their successes, their failures. So that's what Happy Warriors is about.
And Mitch, where can people find you on the interwebs?
Well, my website is mitchhorowitz.com, and I'm on Twitter at Mitch Horowitz. I'm on Instagram at Mitch Horowitz 23. I'm going to be in three dimensions in Los Angeles in late September. You can go to prs.org, Philosophical Research Society, and find my dates. I'm going to be speaking there September 22nd to launch Modern Occultism. I'll be signing the book and giving a talk on the book, and I'll also be collaborating on October 20th with the great supernatural artist Chet Zar. He and I will be giving a joint presentation featuring a lot of Chet's macabre, wonderful artwork. So anyway, lots of stuff coming, and you can find all that stuff on social media or my website.
I will have all of those links put up for the specific page to this episode available at whatmagicisthis.com. Also, there will be a link. If you click on the image of Modern Occultism, you can get a pre-order in, or it'll take you right to a place to buy the book. And this is a fun book, and it's a really wonderful, reads great book. So please support Mitch and what he gets up to by pre-ordering the book or grabbing a copy for yourself. All of those things will be available at whatmagicisthis.com. Also there, you can find a link to my Twitter account, my Instagram account, as well as my Facebook account. And also, if you think that what I am doing is kind of important here on the What Magic Is This podcast, and you'd like to show your support in some way, there's a couple of ways of doing that. I go through it every episode, but I'm going to tell you again, and hopefully I'm not going to take up too much of your time. But I would really appreciate your support in one of these three ways. The first way is the best way of doing so, and that is supporting me through Patreon. That is patreon.com/whatmagicisthis, or head to whatmagicisthis.com and click on any number of the numerous, that site is littered with support me on Patreon buttons. I'm not going to apologize for it, but please, if you can, click on that link and head to my Patreon. It's only $7 American a month. That's nothing. That's some expensive nuts. That's, I don't know, you can buy 4 pine nuts for $7 American. That's not even a pack of diapers for either your baby or your grandpa, or grandma, or anybody, really, for yourself. I don't know. I'm not going to judge. It's the 21st century. Who cares, right? Anybody can wear diapers if they really want to. All I'm saying, $7 a month gets you a whole different podcast. I mean, I do as much work on my Patreon as I do for this main podcast that you listen to for free. For $7, you'll get Patreon episodes on things like specific entities or saints or spirits, or I've done one on Hermanubis, Baphomet, somebody that was, features heavily in the artwork and stories and the whole mythos that Eliphas Levi was all about. Baphomet, yeah, it's all there. It's at my Patreon. Get access to that Discord server I talked about earlier in this episode. Videos about how to do certain things. And sorry if I sighed just there, like, but truthfully, there's so much stuff on my Patreon. $7 a month. It's a steal of a deal, and it goes to support me. This podcast is my job. This is what I do. I told Mitch after I paused this, I was like, man, this is what I do. I don't spend too much time on social media because of the fact that my podcast is my job, and I take it very seriously. And I need this job, and I hope you would like this job, and I need to keep doing it because it is part of a dream of mine. And the only way that I can continue doing this is if you feel your way to supporting me. So best way of doing that, patreon.com/whatmagicisthis, or head to whatmagicisthis.com. Also there, you can find PayPal. If you don't feel like doing the whole Patreon thing, you just want to throw me a little chunk of change, PayPal is the best way of doing that. Just click that button. You can donate $5, $10, $20, $2,000, $200,000, $2 million, bazillion dollars. Any amount helps. It all goes back into making sure this podcast runs. I'm recording this podcast on new equipment. I hope you have noticed a difference. This microphone, I never thought I'd be paying this much for this microphone that I'm recording on right now. Hopefully you can tell a difference, but my goodness, I love the look of this thing. It's great. I'm having a ton of fun with it. It was a bit frustrating, but I think I've got it working. But my goodness, podcasting is expensive and it's not cheap. Sometimes people can make cheap podcasts. I don't want to do that because I want to have the best quality. And so in order to do that, you need to invest money. In order to make money, you got to spend money. And if you donate through the PayPal, that goes right back into the show, hosting, website equipment, all of that kind of thing. So yeah, if you donate through the PayPal, I don't see any of that. It just goes straight back into making sure that this podcast runs the way that it does, that the spokes on this What Magic Is This bicycle are nice and chrome shiny. Anyhow, another way to support the show is to grab some of my merch, t-shirts, notebooks, tote bags, stickers, hoodies. What else? I don't have tapestries. You can get tapestries. I don't have those because who's buying tapestries these days? Anyhow, tapestries. Indiana Jones, Last Crusade. Anyways, doesn't matter. But we're here to inspect the tapestries. Love that film. The best. Haven't seen the new one. Not going to bother. Anyways, I love Indiana Jones. Wow. How did I get... Oh, yeah. So buy some merchandise. I would really appreciate it. Fortune and Glory. See what I did there? Fortune and Glory. Come to my merch store. Buy anything. I don't see very much money from it, but it's great to see you wearing my stuff or using my stuff or writing in my little notebook. I love my notebooks. That is another way of supporting the show. But the way that I wish to see your support is, of course, on the Patreon. $7 a month. I'm not raising my price on that. People are like, there's inflation. And I'm just like, cool. Whatever. So maybe to my own detriment, but $7 a month. The reason it's so low is that I want to see you there. I know in comparison, like a Netflix subscription or some shit, and people shouldn't be supporting Netflix these days. Just going to say, there's things happening. But yeah, that stuff's, just a little bit more than $7. But this goes to helping me be my regular goofy, exuberant self here, just giving you the best takes on occultism and magic and esotericism. So all I got to say, I'd love to see you on Patreon, $7 a month. But all of these things, including where to buy Mitch's new book, where to find Mitch on the interwebs, and where to do all of the things, whatmagicisthis.com. Please head there. Fantastic, Mitch. This has been a wonderful ride, and I really hope that people now have a better idea of the difference perhaps between something like practical ritual magic and occultism, and that there are these figures that probably which many of you are very familiar with, concepts such as Hermeticism and Satanism, but and how they all tie together. And I couldn't have had a better guest on this episode than you, Mitch. So thank you so much for coming on, and I hope to touch base with you again sometime a little bit further on up the road if I was to ask you to come on the show again, or if you decide to reach out to me once more and be like, Bachelor, I need to talk.
Right, I'd be delighted, and thank you. I mean, your questions are just so beautifully informed. Your reading is so critical. You bring such intellectual excellence, but also good humor to this topic, and you've created a very unique space in the field. So thank you.
Oh, Mitch, that's you don't got to wax my Corvette, man. That's my job. I don't need, but I appreciate it nevertheless. And so thank you so much for coming on and for saying such kind words. And
Pleasure.
my goodness, it's Brave New World. It's a wonderful world. Despite what everybody's saying on the internet, I think we do have some really amazing things to look forward to. And as Mitch said, I want to end this here. Take advantage of it. This is special. Everybody, please take advantage of this period of time because it's there's no better time to be around than right now. So that's the show, everybody, and please come on back to What Magic Is This, where we'll talk about more of this strange occulty and yes, guess what? Too bad it includes Satanism, thing we like to call magic, the occult, the esoteric, and the paranormal, the supernatural, and the weird. Until next time, I want each and every one of you to stay healthy, to stay hopeful, and to stay luminous. Until then, ta-ta. Goodbye, everybody.